The hemp rope coiled 3 times around Valentino Ordrick's neck before falling slack in the Colorado mining camp's pre-dawn darkness. By sunrise, his body would join 29 others scattered across 3 territories, each death appearing as isolated tragedy rather than coordinated warfare. This is the story of how one escaped slave named Liora Cindrelle transformed the American frontier into a hunting ground, and why her secret network of liberation fighters would systematically eliminate an entire generation of slave catchers, bounty hunters, and plantation overseers who had made fortunes from human misery. From the gold fields of California to the cattle ranches of Texas, from the trading posts of Kansas to the mining camps of Colorado, Liora's methodical campaign would span 200 miles of untamed territory. Her network moved like shadows through boomtowns and frontier settlements, striking with surgical precision before vanishing into the vast wilderness that had become their weapon. 30 masters would die, none would see their killer's face until the very end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moon cast silver shadows across the Blackstone Canyon mining camp as Liora Cindrelle emerged from Valentino Ordrick's cabin, her hands steady despite what she'd left behind. The bounty hunter who'd terrorized escaped slaves across 3 territories would never collect another reward, his body positioned to suggest he'd simply succumb to the harsh mountain winter. By morning, word would spread through the underground networks that stretched from the California goldfields to the Kansas plains. Another hunter had fallen, another link in the chain of oppression had been severed. This was no isolated incident. Across the American frontier, from the sprawling cattle ranches of Texas to the bustling trading posts of New Mexico territory, a pattern was emerging that territorial authorities were only beginning to recognize. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, and overseers were disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances with increasing frequency. What appeared to be random misfortunes scattered across thousands of miles of wilderness was actually something far more sophisticated and deadly. Liora represented the culmination of a network that had grown from desperate necessity into methodical warfare. The woman who now moved through mining camps and frontier towns with lethal purpose had once been property valued at $800 in a New Orleans slave market. Her transformation from chattel to coordinator of systematic resistance would reshape how the American frontier dealt with the peculiar institution of slavery, proving that even in the vast wilderness of the West, there was nowhere for oppressors to hide. The Blackstone Canyon incident marked the 30th confirmed elimination in what federal marshals had begun calling the frontier disappearances. Each death appeared natural or accidental: heart attacks, hunting accidents, falls from horses, sudden illnesses that struck healthy men in their prime. But the pattern was unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Every victim had made their living from the capture and return of escaped slaves, and every death had occurred in locations where underground railroad networks were known to operate. What territorial authorities didn't understand was that they weren't hunting a single individual or even a small band of outlaws. They were confronting a coordinated intelligence network that spanned the entire western frontier, operated by people who had every reason to remain invisible and every skill necessary to eliminate threats to their freedom. The hunted had become the hunters, and the vast wilderness that had once sheltered escaped slaves had become a killing ground for those who would drag them back to bondage. Valentino Ordrick's death would trigger the largest manhunt in frontier history, but by the time federal marshals arrived in Blackstone Canyon, Liora would be 200 miles away, moving through networks of safe houses and sympathetic contacts that stretched across territories where law enforcement remained scattered and communication traveled at the speed of horseback. The woman who'd strangled 30 masters had become a ghost story whispered around campfires, a legend that struck fear into the hearts of those who profited from human misery while inspiring hope in communities that had learned to trust no one in authority. The frontier justice that Liora and her network dispensed operated by different rules than the courts and marshals of territorial government. Their trials took place in the shadows, their sentences were carried out with hemp rope and plant poisons, and their appeals process was as final as the grave. But their methods had proven remarkably effective at disrupting the machinery of slave catching that had made the Western territories as dangerous for escaped slaves as the plantations they'd fled. This is the story of how one woman's quest for personal vengeance evolved into a systematic campaign that would challenge the foundations of slavery in the American West. It's a tale of intelligence networks and coordinated resistance, of justice served in darkness and freedom purchased with blood. Most of all, it's the story of how the vast wilderness that had always been seen as America's great escape valve became the stage for a war that most people never knew was being fought. The American frontier of 1852 sprawled across territories where civilization existed as isolated islands of settlements scattered across an ocean of wilderness. From the California goldfields to the New Mexico trading posts, from the Kansas plains to the Colorado mining camps, the West represented both opportunity and danger on a scale that defied Eastern comprehension. Here, in towns that appeared overnight and disappeared just as quickly, the normal rules of law and society bent under the pressure of distance, desperation, and the constant struggle for survival. The discovery of gold in California had triggered a migration that transformed the Western territories into a chaotic mixture of cultures, languages, and legal systems. Mexican rancheros found themselves neighbors to New England abolitionists, while Southern plantation owners established cattle operations alongside German immigrants and Chinese laborers. The result was a patchwork of competing jurisdictions and conflicting laws that created countless opportunities for those who knew how to exploit the gaps between authority and enforcement. Slavery existed in the West not as the plantation-based institution of the Deep South, but as a more fluid and opportunistic system that adapted to frontier conditions. Escaped slaves who'd made their way west found that freedom remained precarious even in territories where slavery was nominally prohibited. Federal law still required the return of fugitive slaves regardless of territorial statutes, and the Compromise of 1850 had strengthened the legal framework that enabled slave catchers to operate across state and territorial lines. The bounty hunters who pursued escaped slaves in the Western territories represented a particularly ruthless breed of entrepreneur. Men like Valentino Ordrick could earn more from a single capture than most settlers made in a year, creating powerful incentives for violence and deception. They operated with federal warrants that gave them broad authority to pursue fugitives across jurisdictional boundaries, often working in partnership with local law enforcement that was either sympathetic to slavery or simply interested in the substantial rewards offered for cooperation. Blackstone Canyon exemplified the kind of boom town that had mushroomed across the mining territories, a settlement of 500 souls who'd followed rumors of silver deposits into the Colorado mountains. The town consisted of a main street lined with saloons, gambling houses, and supply stores, surrounded by a chaos of tents, shanties, and hastily constructed cabins that housed miners, merchants, and the various service providers who fed off their desperation and ambition. Law enforcement consisted of a part-time sheriff, who spent more time mediating claim disputes than investigating crimes, supported by a legal system that operated more on frontier custom than statutory authority. These boom towns provided perfect hunting grounds for bounty hunters because their transient populations made it easy for strangers to blend in while conducting surveillance on suspected fugitives. The same anonymity that protected escaped slaves also sheltered the men who hunted them, creating a deadly game of hide-and-seek that played out in saloons, mining claims, and the wilderness trails that connected isolated settlements across vast distances. The underground railroad networks that had developed in the eastern states had adapted to Western conditions by becoming more militarized and self-sufficient. Rather than relying primarily on concealment and misdirection, Western networks had begun incorporating former soldiers, mountain men, and others who possessed the skills necessary for armed resistance in territories where help from law enforcement could not be assumed. These networks had learned to think strategically about eliminating threats rather than simply evading them. Communication across the frontier traveled through a combination of official postal services, private courier networks, and informal systems of gossip and rumor that connected communities separated by hundreds of miles. Messages that might take weeks to travel through official channels could move much faster through networks of traders, miners, and travelers who carried information along with their goods and services. This parallel communication system allowed underground networks to coordinate activities across vast distances while remaining invisible to territorial authorities. The federal government's presence in the Western territories remained minimal and scattered, with military posts and territorial offices separated by distances that made coordinated law enforcement nearly impossible. This created a situation where criminal organizations could operate across multiple territories without facing unified resistance, while also providing opportunities for resistance networks to establish bases of operation in areas where government authority was more theoretical than practical. Within this chaotic environment, stories and legends traveled faster than official reports, creating a folklore that shaped behavior even in communities where the underlying facts remained unknown. Tales of mysterious deaths and disappearances became part of the oral tradition that connected frontier communities, warning potential victims while inspiring those who had reason to celebrate the elimination of their oppressors. The line between fact and fiction blurred in an environment where survival often depended on reputation and intimidation as much as actual capability. Liora Cindrelle had been born into slavery on a South Carolina rice plantation, but the woman who now moved through Western mining camps with lethal purpose bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who'd watched federal marshals drag her husband Marcus Tharvin back to bondage in the spring of 1849. That moment of helpless rage, when the man she loved disappeared into a slave catcher's wagon while she hid in the Kansas prairie grass, had crystallized her understanding that freedom would never be secure as long as the hunters remained alive to pursue it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus had been everything to Liora during their 3 years of fugitive life together. They'd escaped separately from different plantations, met in a Cincinnati safe house, and traveled west along underground railroad routes that promised security in territories where slavery faced legal challenges. Marcus possessed skills as a blacksmith that made him valuable in frontier communities, while Liora's experience with herbal medicine had earned her acceptance in settlements where doctors were scarce and expensive. Their life in Lawrence, Kansas had seemed to offer the stability they'd never known as slaves. Marcus had established a thriving blacksmith shop that served the growing community of Free State settlers, while Liora had built a reputation as a healer whose plant-based remedies could treat everything from mining injuries to childhood fevers. They'd even begun planning a wedding ceremony, the first legal marriage either had ever contemplated, when Rowick Calvain's bounty hunting party arrived with federal warrants and firepower that the local sheriff dared not oppose. The capture had been methodically planned and ruthlessly executed. Calvain's men had spent weeks observing the couple's routines, identifying their associates, and planning an approach that would minimize resistance while maximizing their chances of collecting both the substantial rewards offered for Marcus and Liora's return. They'd struck just before dawn, surrounding the blacksmith shop where Marcus worked early each morning, using superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm any possibility of escape. Liora's survival had been pure luck and split-second decision-making. She'd been gathering herbs in the prairie beyond town when she heard the gunshots and shouting that announced the attack on their home. From a concealed position in the tall grass, she'd watched Marcus being beaten unconscious and loaded into a reinforced wagon designed for prisoner transport, while Calvain's men searched systematically for any sign of her presence. Her choice to remain hidden rather than attempt a rescue had saved her life while condemning her to witness the destruction of everything that mattered. The psychological impact of watching Marcus's capture had transformed Liora from a woman seeking personal freedom into someone who understood that security required the systematic elimination of threats. During the weeks that followed, as she made her way through underground railroad networks toward the relative safety of Colorado territory, she'd carried with her not just grief but a growing understanding that the bounty hunting system represented a form of warfare that demanded military responses. Her education in the techniques of resistance had begun during the journey west, as she'd encountered other survivors of bounty hunter attacks who'd learned to fight back using methods adapted from their experiences as slaves. From them, she'd learned that the same skills that had enabled survival under bondage—invisibility, patience, the ability to appear harmless while gathering intelligence— could be weaponized against oppressors who'd grown comfortable with their dominance. The transformation from victim to predator had accelerated when Liora reached the mining camps of Colorado territory, where she'd discovered a community of escaped slaves who'd organized themselves into mutual protection networks. Unlike the passive concealment strategies of Eastern Underground Railroad operations, these Western networks had embraced active defense, including the systematic gathering of intelligence on bounty hunters and the coordination of strikes against those who posed the greatest threats. Liora's knowledge of herbal medicine had made her invaluable to these networks, but her personal motivation for revenge had made her something more dangerous. While others focused on defense and evasion, she'd begun studying the possibility of systematic offense, identifying ways to target the bounty hunting network's leadership and funding sources. Her patient observation of enemy tactics and psychology had revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right combination of medical knowledge and strategic thinking. The death of Wayne Drellin, a notorious slave catcher who'd operated throughout the Colorado Territory, had marked Liora's transition from survivor to active combatant. Drellin's apparent heart attack during a poker game in a Leadville saloon had been attributed to the altitude and heavy drinking that characterized life in the mining camps. But Liora had known better. The digitalis she'd introduced into his whiskey had been carefully calculated to mimic natural cardiac failure, while ensuring that the man who'd captured and tortured dozens of escaped slaves would never harm anyone again. The success of her first planned elimination had convinced Liora that systematic targeting of bounty hunters could be both feasible and effective. Her medical knowledge provided methods that appeared natural, her experience with underground networks provided intelligence about targets and opportunities, and her personal motivation provided the psychological strength necessary for work that required killing without hesitation or remorse. Over the following 2 years, as her reputation spread through the networks of escaped slaves and sympathetic settlers, Liora had evolved from lone operator to coordinator of a systematic campaign. She'd recruited others who shared her combination of personal motivation and practical skills, creating a decentralized network that could operate across multiple territories while maintaining the security that came from cellular organization and careful compartmentalization of sensitive information. The transformation of personal revenge into systematic warfare required intelligence networks that could rival those of territorial governments in their scope and sophistication. Liora's first challenge had been developing reliable methods for identifying and tracking bounty hunters across territories, where official records were scarce, and personal information was carefully guarded. The solution had emerged from the Underground Railroad's existing communication networks, which already maintained detailed intelligence about threats to escaped slaves throughout the Western Territories. Saloons served as crucial intelligence gathering centers, places where bounty hunters gathered to share information about targets and coordinate their activities. Liora had recruited bartenders, serving girls, and cleaning staff who could overhear conversations while remaining invisible to men who'd trained themselves to ignore the presence of service workers. These human assets provided not just information about current operations but insights into the personal habits and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone planning targeted eliminations. The medical practice that Liora had established in Denver provided perfect cover for her intelligence operations, while giving her access to the materials and knowledge necessary for systematic poisoning. Frontier communities desperately needed medical services, and Liora's reputation as a skilled healer had earned her acceptance in circles that might otherwise have been suspicious of a woman with her background. Her patients often included bounty hunters and their associates, men who never suspected that the woman treating their injuries was studying their weaknesses and gathering information about their operations. Plant identification and preparation had become a science under Liora's methodical approach to developing reliable killing methods. The Colorado Territory's diverse ecosystem provided access to numerous toxic species, from the digitalis that grew in mountain meadows to the oleander that flourished in the warmer valleys. She'd spent months experimenting with dosages and delivery methods, using condemned criminals and dying patients as unwitting test subjects for compounds that needed to mimic natural deaths while ensuring reliable lethality. The challenge of coordinating operations across multiple territories had required the development of communication systems that could function independently of official postal services. Liora had established a network of couriers who traveled established trade routes between mining camps, carrying messages that appeared to be routine business correspondence but actually contained coded intelligence about targets and operational plans. These couriers were often escaped slaves themselves, men and women who had powerful incentives to maintain operational security while serving a cause that directly protected their own freedom. Weapons training had been another crucial component of preparing for systematic operations. While poison provided an ideal method for eliminations that needed to appear natural, Liora had recognized that some situations would require more direct confrontation. She'd sought training from former soldiers and mountain men who possessed the combat skills necessary for close-quarters killing, learning techniques for silent elimination that could be employed when subtlety was less important than speed and certainty. The recruitment and training of operatives had followed principles adapted from military organization with careful attention to security and compartmentalization. Liora had identified candidates based on their personal motivations, practical skills, and psychological suitability for work that required killing without hesitation. Each recruit underwent months of preparation that included not just technical training, but psychological conditioning designed to overcome the moral inhibitions that might interfere with necessary violence. Financial resources had been secured through a combination of theft, extortion, and legitimate business operations. Bounty hunters typically carried substantial amounts of cash, making them attractive targets for robbery that could be disguised as random frontier violence. The network had also developed protection rackets that charged fees from businesses that employed escaped slaves, offering security services that were both genuine and highly effective at deterring bounty hunter operations. Safe houses had been established throughout the territories using a combination of purchased property and agreements with sympathetic settlers. These facilities provided bases for operational planning while offering secure locations where operatives could retreat after completing missions. The safe house network had been designed with multiple escape routes and communication systems that would allow rapid evacuation if any location became compromised by law enforcement or enemy action. The psychological preparation for systematic killing had required overcoming moral inhibitions that might have prevented effective operations. Liora had developed training methods that emphasized the military nature of their conflict, portraying bounty hunters as enemy combatants, whose elimination served the cause of freedom rather than personal revenge. This reframing had been crucial for recruits, who possessed the necessary skills but lacked the psychological hardness required for premeditated murder. Intelligence about law enforcement capabilities and limitations had been gathered through careful observation of territorial justice systems. Liora had studied the jurisdictional conflicts and resource constraints that limited coordination between different agencies, identifying gaps that could be exploited by criminal organizations operating across territorial boundaries. This intelligence had been crucial for planning operations that could be completed before effective law enforcement response could be organized. The establishment of legitimate businesses had provided both cover and funding for network operations. Liora's medical practice had been supplemented by other enterprises, including trading posts, freight operations, and mining claims that generated revenue while providing reasons for network members to travel freely throughout the territories. These businesses had also created opportunities to gather intelligence about economic activities that supported the bounty hunting industry. The elimination of Karl Malric marked the beginning of Liora's systematic campaign against the bounty hunting networks that had made the Western Territories a hunting ground for escaped slaves. Malric had built a reputation throughout Colorado Territory as a ruthless and effective slave catcher, whose methods included torture and intimidation tactics that exceeded even the brutal norms of his profession. His death would serve both as personal satisfaction for Liora and as a demonstration to other network members that their most dangerous enemies could be eliminated with proper planning and execution. Malric's habits had been studied for 3 months through careful surveillance conducted by network operatives who'd infiltrated the social circles that surrounded bounty hunting operations in Denver. The intelligence gathered revealed a man whose arrogance and sense of invulnerability had made him careless about personal security. He maintained regular routines that included weekly visits to specific saloons, gambling houses, and brothels, creating predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone planning an elimination. The approach selected for Malric's elimination combined Liora's medical expertise with psychological warfare designed to terrorize other bounty hunters. Rather than attempting to make his death appear natural, the plan called for a killing that would be clearly intentional while providing no evidence that could lead to the identification of those responsible. The message would be unmistakable. Bounty hunters were now targets rather than hunters. Liora had chosen oleander extract as her weapon, a compound that would cause rapid cardiac arrest while leaving traces that any competent physician would recognize as poisoning. The delivery method involved contaminating Malric's regular whiskey supply at the Red Mountain Saloon, where he spent most evenings gambling and bragging about his recent captures. The bartender, a freed slave named Jasmine Orville who'd lost her husband to Malric's operations, had volunteered to serve as the delivery agent despite the risks involved. The execution had been scheduled for a Thursday evening when Malrich's routines brought him to the Red Mountain at his most vulnerable moment. He typically arrived around 8 o'clock, already half drunk from earlier stops, and spent several hours at his preferred poker table while consuming large quantities of whiskey that would mask any unusual taste from the added oleander extract. The timing had been calculated to ensure that symptoms would manifest while Malrich was still in the saloon, providing witnesses to his death while ensuring that suspicion would fall on his numerous enemies rather than any specific individual. Jasmine's performance that evening had been flawless, her service appearing entirely normal despite the lethal dose of oleander extract that she'd introduced into Malrich's whiskey bottle during a moment when his attention was focused on the card game. Her long experience as a slave had taught her the kind of invisibility that made servants essentially transparent to their employers, skills that proved equally effective in allowing her to poison an enemy without arousing any suspicion about her activities. The oleander had worked exactly as Liora's experiments had predicted, causing symptoms that began as chest pain and difficulty breathing before progressing rapidly to cardiac arrest. Malrich's collapse at the poker table had created exactly the kind of dramatic scene that would generate stories and speculation throughout the bounty hunting community. His final words, gasped out between convulsions, had been a desperate attempt to identify his killer that had yielded nothing but incoherent accusations against everyone present. The death had been investigated by Denver's part-time sheriff, a man whose experience with violent crime was limited to the routine shootings and knifings that characterized frontier justice. His examination had confirmed poisoning as the cause of death, but his investigation had focused on Malrich's gambling associates and business competitors, rather than considering the possibility of organized resistance from the escaped slave community. The sheriff's final report had attributed the killing to unknown enemies, possibly related to territorial disputes or gambling debts. News of Malrich's death had spread through underground networks within days of his elimination, carried by the same communication systems that normally warned of approaching dangers. The reaction among escaped slave communities had been celebration mixed with anxiety about possible retaliation, while bounty hunters throughout the territory had responded with increased caution about their personal security and operational methods. Liora's second target had been selected based on intelligence gathered during the investigation of Malrich's death. Aaron Crestvale operated a slave-catching business that employed teams of hunters throughout Kansas territory, making him a high-value target whose elimination would disrupt multiple operations while sending a clear message about the network's capabilities. His death would also test whether the success against Malrich could be replicated using different methods and operational approaches. Crestvale's elimination had been planned as a hunting accident that would occur during one of his regular scouting expeditions into the prairie regions where escaped slaves were known to establish temporary camps. The method selected involved tampering with his rifle's ammunition, creating a catastrophic malfunction that would appear to be the result of defective gunpowder or poor maintenance rather than deliberate sabotage. The technical aspects of the ammunition tampering had required expertise that Liora had acquired through consultation with former military personnel who joined the network. The modification involved inserting additional gunpowder into cartridges that would create excessive pressure when fired, causing the rifle barrel to explode and directing metal fragments toward the shooter with lethal force. The tampering had been accomplished during a break-in at Crestvale's equipment storage facility, where network operatives had gained access to his ammunition supplies without leaving evidence of their intrusion. Crestvale's death had occurred exactly as planned during a solo reconnaissance mission that had taken him into prairie regions south of Lawrence, Kansas. The rifle explosion had been witnessed by his horse, which had returned to town without its rider, prompting a search that had discovered Crestvale's body, along with the remains of his destroyed weapon. The investigating authorities had attributed the death to a tragic accident involving defective ammunition, never suspecting that the explosion had been deliberately engineered. The success of these initial eliminations had convinced Liora that systematic targeting of bounty hunting leadership could be both feasible and effective. The methods developed for Malrich and Crestvale had proven that deaths could be engineered to appear accidental or natural, while still sending clear messages about the risks of continuing operations against escaped slaves. The psychological impact on the bounty hunting community had been immediate and substantial, with several known slave catchers abandoning their operations in Colorado and Kansas territories rather than risk becoming targets themselves. Intelligence gathered after these initial successes had revealed that bounty hunting operations throughout the Western territories were beginning to adapt to the new threat environment. Hunters were traveling in larger groups, varying their routines and implementing security measures that reflected their understanding that they'd become prey rather than predators. These adaptations would require corresponding evolution in network tactics and methods, but they also represented confirmation that the campaign was achieving its strategic objectives of disrupting enemy operations and protecting escaped slave communities. The transformation of Liora's network from a small group of individual operators into a coordinated resistance organization capable of simultaneous operations across 3 territories had required fundamental changes in structure, communication, and strategic planning. By the winter of 1852, what had begun as personal revenge had evolved into systematic warfare that threatened the economic foundations of the bounty hunting industry throughout the American West. The success of the initial eliminations had attracted new recruits while providing the resources and intelligence necessary for operations of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The recruitment of Elmira Fenwick had marked a crucial turning point in the network's operational capabilities. Fenwick had arrived in Colorado Territory as part of a wagon train that included several families of escaped slaves seeking security in the mining camps. But her background as a former house slave in a wealthy Virginia plantation had provided her with skills that proved invaluable for intelligence gathering and social manipulation. Her ability to move through respectable society while maintaining the facade of a loyal servant had made her the perfect agent for infiltrating the social circles that supported and financed bounty hunting operations. Fenwick's first major contribution had been the identification of Elias Viereck, a wealthy Denver merchant whose legitimate freight business provided cover for a slave-catching operation that extended throughout Colorado and Kansas territories. Viereck's elimination would require methods more sophisticated than those used against individual bounty hunters, since his death would trigger investigations by business associates and territorial authorities who had substantial financial interests in his continued survival. The solution had emerged from careful study of Viereck's business operations, which revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited through coordinated attacks on his supply chains and transportation networks. The campaign against Viereck had begun with systematic sabotage of his freight wagons during their regular runs between Denver and the Kansas trading posts. Network operatives had infiltrated his employee roster, gaining access to transportation schedules and route information that allowed precise timing of attacks designed to appear as random bandit activity. The sabotage had involved everything from loosened wagon wheels that would fail during river crossings to contaminated feed that would sicken or kill the horses and mules essential for freight operations. The psychological pressure on Viereck had been intensified through a series of anonymous messages that made clear his freight business was being targeted specifically because of his involvement in slave catching. The messages, delivered through intermediaries who could not be traced back to the network, had contained detailed information about his operations that demonstrated the senders possessed intimate knowledge of his business activities. The implicit threat had been unmistakable: abandon the slave-catching operations or face escalating attacks on his legitimate enterprises. When Viereck had refused to cease his bounty hunting activities, the network had implemented the final phase of their campaign. Elmira Fenwick had gained access to Viereck's private residence by posing as a domestic worker seeking employment, using forged references that portrayed her as an experienced house servant displaced by the death of her previous employer. Her acceptance into Viereck's household had provided the opportunity for close observation of his personal habits, while positioning her to carry out an elimination that would appear to be the result of natural causes. The method selected for Viereck's elimination had combined Liora's expertise in plant toxicology with Fenwick's knowledge of household routines and food preparation. Digitalis extract had been introduced into Viereck's morning coffee over a period of several weeks, with dosages carefully calculated to cause gradual heart failure that would mimic the effects of stress and overwork. The prolonged timeline had been necessary to avoid suspicion, while ensuring that Viereck's death would appear to be the natural consequence of a demanding business schedule rather than deliberate poisoning. Viereck's death had occurred exactly as planned, with symptoms manifesting during a business meeting that included several prominent Denver merchants and territorial officials. His collapse had been attributed to heart failure brought on by the financial pressures of his recent freight business losses, creating a perfect cover story that explained his death, while reinforcing the network's reputation for systematic retaliation against those who persisted in slave-catching activities. The elimination of Ordrick had demonstrated the network's ability to target not just individual bounty hunters, but the financial infrastructure that supported their operations. The success had encouraged expansion into new territories, with the establishment of cells in Texas and New Mexico that could coordinate operations while maintaining the security that came from decentralized command structures. Each cell operated independently while sharing intelligence and resources that multiplied their effectiveness beyond what any individual group could achieve. The Texas operations had been organized around the recruitment of Liora Cindrelle, a former plantation slave whose escape from a East Texas cotton operation had been facilitated by underground railroad networks. Cindrelle's intimate knowledge of slave-catching operations in Texas, combined with her connections among escaped slave communities throughout the state, had made her the ideal leader for expansion into territory where bounty hunting had become a major industry, serving the demand from cotton plantations that required constant replacement of their labor forces. The first major success in Texas had been the elimination of Nelson Valentino, a bounty hunter whose operations extended throughout the eastern counties, where cotton cultivation had created substantial demand for slave labor. Valentino's methods had been particularly brutal even by frontier standards, involving the use of tracking dogs and torture techniques that had made him a priority target for network operations. His elimination had been planned as a coordinated attack that would occur during one of his regular slave hunting expeditions, using methods that would leave no doubt about the intentional nature of his death. The attack on Valentino had involved a coordinated ambush by multiple network operatives who had tracked his movements through intelligence gathered from escaped slave communities familiar with his operational patterns. The ambush site had been selected to provide maximum tactical advantage while ensuring that Valentino's body would be discovered in circumstances that would terrorize other bounty hunters without providing evidence that could lead to the identification of those responsible. Valentino's death had been accomplished using methods that combined direct violence with psychological warfare designed to send clear messages to other bounty hunters. The strangulation had been carried out using hemp rope, the same material commonly used for slave restraints, creating symbolic connections that would not be lost on those familiar with bounty hunting practices. His body had been positioned in a manner that suggested ritualistic execution, with personal effects arranged to indicate that his death was punishment for specific crimes against escaped slaves. The discovery of Valentino's body had created panic among Texas bounty hunters, many of whom had immediately suspended their operations while seeking safety in larger towns where law enforcement presence might provide some protection against further attacks. The psychological impact had been amplified by the network's decision to claim responsibility for the killing through messages delivered to local newspapers and territorial officials. The messages had made clear that Valentino's death was part of a systematic campaign rather than an isolated incident, warning that other bounty hunters would face similar fates if they continued their operations. The expansion into New Mexico territory had followed similar patterns, with the recruitment of Valentino providing the foundation for operations in regions where the mixture of Mexican and American legal systems created opportunities for slave catchers, while also providing cover for resistance activities. Valentino's background as a translator and guide had given her access to information about cross-border slave-catching operations that targeted escaped slaves seeking refuge in Mexican territory, where slavery had been abolished decades earlier. The New Mexico operations had focused on disrupting the networks of informants and collaborators who provided intelligence to bounty hunters operating along the international border. Rather than targeting individual hunters, the strategy had emphasized eliminating the local contacts who made cross-border operations possible, using methods that would appear to be the result of territorial disputes or conflicts between different ethnic communities rather than organized resistance. The systematic targeting of collaborators had proven highly effective at disrupting bounty hunting operations while requiring fewer resources than direct attacks on well-armed and organized hunting parties. The elimination of key informants had forced bounty hunters to operate without reliable local intelligence, making their expeditions far more dangerous and less successful, while reducing the threat they posed to escaped slave communities seeking refuge in Mexican territory. By the spring of 1853, the network's operations had expanded to include over 40 active operatives distributed across 3 territories, with support networks that included hundreds of sympathizers who provided intelligence, resources, and safe houses for ongoing operations. The transformation from individual revenge to systematic resistance had created an organization capable of sustained warfare against the institutions that supported slavery in the American West. proving that coordinated action could achieve strategic objectives that individual acts of violence could never accomplish. The success of the expanded operations had also attracted increased attention from territorial and federal law enforcement agencies, who had begun to recognize patterns that suggested organized criminal activity rather than isolated incidents. The response had included the deployment of federal marshals specifically assigned to investigate the bounty hunter killings, creating new challenges that would require corresponding evolution in network tactics and security procedures. The war between the network and the bounty hunting industry was entering a new phase that would test whether systematic resistance could survive systematic opposition from territorial authorities. The arrival of Federal Marshal Arendor Valcrest in Denver during the early summer of 1853 marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of Liora's campaign against the bounty hunting networks that had terrorized escaped slaves throughout the Western territories. Valcrest had been dispatched from Washington with unprecedented authority and resources to investigate what federal officials had finally recognized as a coordinated conspiracy rather than isolated frontier violence. His reputation as a methodical investigator who'd broken up several major criminal organizations in California had made him the government's choice for confronting a threat that had begun to undermine the entire system of slave recovery in the American West. Valcrest's investigation had been triggered by intelligence reports that had reached the Federal Marshal Service through territorial officials who'd finally connected the seemingly random deaths of bounty hunters across multiple jurisdictions. The pattern analysis that had convinced Washington to authorize a major federal investigation had identified at least 23 suspicious deaths that shared common elements. All victims had been involved in slave catching. All deaths had occurred in territories with significant populations of escaped slaves, and all investigations had failed to identify suspects despite evidence suggesting deliberate elimination rather than natural causes or accidents. The Marshal's approach to the investigation had demonstrated a level of sophistication that represented a genuine threat to network security for the first time since operations had begun. Rather than focusing on individual incidents, Valcrest had organized his investigation around the assumption that he was confronting a military-style organization with command structures, communication systems, and operational capabilities that exceeded anything law enforcement had previously encountered in the territories. His first actions had included the establishment of a coordinated intelligence network that connected federal, territorial, and local law enforcement agencies in unprecedented cooperation. Intelligence about Valcrest's investigation had reached Liora through the network's contacts in territorial government offices, where clerks and support staff who were either sympathetic to the abolitionist cause or simply corruptible had provided advance warning about federal plans. The information had revealed that Valcrest possessed detailed files on suspected network activities, including accurate assessments of operational methods and organizational structures that suggested someone with inside knowledge had been providing information to federal authorities. The discovery that the network had been penetrated by federal informants had triggered a comprehensive security review that had exposed vulnerabilities in operational procedures and communication systems. The investigation had identified several network members whose activities had attracted official attention, along with safe houses and supply chains that had been compromised by surveillance operations conducted with resources and expertise far beyond what territorial authorities could deploy. The revelation had forced fundamental changes in network operations while creating paranoia that threatened to destroy the trust and coordination that had made systematic resistance possible. Liora's response to the federal threat had involved a strategic decision to accelerate operations while implementing new security measures designed to protect the network's most valuable assets and operational capabilities. The acceleration had meant abandoning the careful timeline that had previously governed target selection, instead focusing on high-value eliminations that could disrupt federal investigation, while demonstrating the network's continued capability to strike at will against those who threatened escaped slave communities. The first target selected for the accelerated campaign had been Alvin Crestvale, brother of the previously eliminated Aaron Crestvale, and a key figure in the Kansas Territory bounty hunting operations that provided intelligence and logistical support to federal marshals. Alvin's elimination had been planned not just to remove a dangerous enemy, but to send a clear message to federal authorities that their investigation would come at a personal cost to everyone who supported it. The method selected for Alvin's elimination had combined direct confrontation with psychological warfare designed to terrorize other potential collaborators with federal authorities. Rather than the subtle poisoning or apparent accidents that had characterized previous operations, the network had chosen to make Alvin's death clearly intentional, while demonstrating capabilities that would convince federal marshals they were confronting opponents with training and resources that rivaled their own. The elimination had been carried out by a team of 4 network operatives led by Callista Norwin, a former house slave whose experience with weapons and tactics had made her one of the network's most capable field commanders. The team had tracked Alvin during one of his regular supply runs between Kansas settlements, selecting an ambush site that would provide tactical advantages while ensuring that his death would be discovered in circumstances that would maximize psychological impact on other bounty hunters and their federal allies. The ambush had been executed with military precision that had demonstrated the network's evolution from a collection of individual operators into a coordinated force capable of complex operations. Alvin's death had involved not just strangulation using the hemp rope that had become the network's signature method, but also the systematic destruction of his equipment and supplies in ways that created clear messages about the consequences of collaboration with federal authorities. His body had been positioned with symbolic elements that referenced specific crimes he'd committed against escaped slaves, creating a tableau that would communicate the network's motivations while terrorizing those who might consider following his example. The discovery of Alvin's body had triggered a massive response from federal and territorial authorities that had included the deployment of military units to supplement Marshal Service resources. The escalation had represented exactly the kind of federal attention that network security procedures had been designed to avoid, but Liora had calculated that demonstrating the network's ability to strike at will, despite increased law enforcement presence, would ultimately prove more valuable than maintaining low profiles that might no longer provide effective protection. Federal Marshal Valcrest's response to the Alvin Crestvale elimination had revealed both the strengths and limitations of his investigation. The crime scene analysis had demonstrated sophisticated forensic capabilities that had identified physical evidence linking the killing to previous network operations, providing the first concrete proof that federal authorities were confronting an organized conspiracy rather than isolated incidents. However, the evidence had also revealed the fundamental challenge facing any law enforcement effort against an organization composed primarily of people who were legally considered property rather than citizens, with rights that needed to be respected during investigation and prosecution. The federal investigation had been hampered by the legal status of escaped slaves, who could not be compelled to testify against their protectors without simultaneously incriminating themselves as fugitives subject to return to bondage. The result had been an investigation that could identify evidence of organized criminal activity while lacking the legal tools necessary to prosecute those responsible, creating a situation that federal marshals found both professionally frustrating and personally disturbing. Liora's decision to confront federal authority directly had come after intelligence reports had revealed that Valcrest's investigation was closing in on network leadership, despite the legal obstacles that prevented effective prosecution of individual operatives. The Marshal's strategy had focused on identifying and capturing network leaders, whose elimination would destroy operational coordination, even if individual cells continued to function independently. The threat to network leadership had required a response that would either eliminate the federal investigation entirely or demonstrate that the costs of continued pursuit exceeded any possible benefits. The target selected for direct confrontation with federal authority had been Marshal Valcrest himself, whose elimination would serve multiple strategic purposes while testing whether the network possessed the capabilities necessary for sustained conflict with federal law enforcement. Valcrest's death would eliminate the most dangerous threat to network security, while sending an unmistakable message to federal authorities that systematic resistance could not be suppressed through conventional law enforcement methods. The operation against Valcrest had been planned as the network's most sophisticated and dangerous mission, requiring coordination between multiple cells and the deployment of resources that would leave the organization vulnerable to retaliation if the mission failed. The plan had involved infiltration of federal facilities, assassination of a high-ranking federal official, and extraction procedures that would allow the operatives involved to escape federal retaliation while maintaining operational security for the network as a whole. The technical aspects of the operation had required capabilities that pushed the network's resources to their limits, including the acquisition of federal uniforms and identification documents that would allow operatives to approach Valcrest without arousing suspicion. The infiltration had been accomplished through the recruitment of a federal clerk whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable to blackmail, providing access to official facilities and advance information about Valcrest's schedule and security arrangements. The assassination had been carried out during a federal meeting in Denver that had brought together territorial officials and law enforcement representatives to coordinate the response to network activities. Liora had personally volunteered for the mission, using her medical knowledge to prepare toxins that would cause rapid but silent death while allowing her to approach the target in the guise of serving refreshments during the official proceedings. The execution had required split-second timing that had tested every aspect of the network's training and preparation, with Liora approaching Valcrest during a break in the proceedings when his attention was focused on documents rather than potential threats. The poison delivery had been accomplished through a modified pen that had injected toxins when Valcrest had accepted what appeared to be a routine document for his signature, creating a delivery method that had left no immediate evidence of the attack. Valcrest's death had occurred within minutes of the poison injection, his collapse during the federal meeting creating exactly the kind of dramatic demonstration of network capabilities that Liora had intended. The marshal's final words had been a desperate warning to his colleagues about the sophistication of the organization they were confronting, providing confirmation that federal authorities had finally understood the true nature of the resistance they faced. The federal response to Valcrest's assassination had exceeded even Liora's most pessimistic projections, with the deployment of military units and the declaration of martial law in territories where network activities had been most concentrated. The escalation had marked the transformation of the conflict from law enforcement investigation to military campaign, creating new challenges that would test whether systematic resistance could survive systematic oppression, backed by federal military resources. However, Valcrest's elimination had also achieved its intended strategic objectives, disrupting federal coordination while demonstrating that no federal official was beyond the network's reach if they chose to target escaped slave communities. The psychological impact on territorial authorities and bounty hunting organizations had been immediate and substantial, with several major slave-catching operations suspending their activities, rather than risk becoming targets for an organization that had proven capable of eliminating federal marshals with apparent impunity. The manhunt that followed Federal Marshal Arendor Valcrest's assassination represented the largest deployment of federal resources in the Western Territories since the Mexican War, with over 300 soldiers and marshals scouring the landscape for an organization that had seemingly vanished into the vast wilderness from which it had emerged. By winter of 1853, military patrols had searched every known safehouse, interrogated hundreds of suspected sympathizers, and established checkpoints on every major trail and river crossing from California to Kansas Territory. Yet Liora Cindrelle and her network of systematic killers had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the legend of 30 dead masters and a transformed understanding of what resistance could accomplish when properly organized and ruthlessly executed. The federal investigation's failure to capture any network leadership had exposed fundamental limitations in how territorial authorities understood the communities they governed and the threats they faced. Military commanders had approached the search using conventional tactics designed for confronting organized criminal gangs or hostile tribes, never fully comprehending that they were pursuing an organization that drew its strength from the very people that federal law classified as property rather than citizens. The escaped slave communities that had provided the network's foundation possessed every incentive to resist interrogation while maintaining operational security, creating an environment where federal resources were deployed against populations that had no legal obligation to cooperate with investigations into their own liberation. Intelligence reports that reached Washington during the winter months had painted a picture of territories where the fundamental assumptions underlying slavery enforcement had been permanently altered by the network's campaign. Bounty hunting operations had been reduced by an estimated 70% across the 3 territories where eliminations had been most concentrated, with many professional slave catchers abandoning their operations entirely rather than risk becoming targets for an organization whose capabilities had been demonstrated with lethal effectiveness. The economic impact had extended beyond the immediate disruption of slave recovery operations to affect the broader systems of credit and insurance that had made large-scale slavery profitable in frontier regions where labor security had always been problematic. Territorial governors had reported that the psychological impact of the elimination campaign had created changes in social relationships that extended far beyond the immediate threat to bounty hunters and their associates. Escaped slave communities that had previously lived in constant fear of recapture had begun organizing more openly, establishing settlements and economic activities that would have been impossible when systematic slave catching had made anonymity the only viable survival strategy. The demonstration that organized resistance could neutralize the enforcement mechanisms that supported slavery had encouraged more aggressive assertions of freedom that challenged the entire legal framework governing race relations in the territories. The transformation had been most dramatic in Colorado Territory, where mining camps that had previously excluded escaped slaves had begun actively recruiting workers whose legal status remained ambiguous, but whose labor had become essential for operations that competed with enterprises in California and other territories where racial restrictions were less rigorously enforced. The economic logic of frontier development had begun to override the social preferences that had supported slavery, creating conditions where freedom could be purchased through productivity rather than secured only through legal documentation that remained inaccessible to most escaped slaves. However, the network's most significant achievement had been the establishment of operational methods and organizational principles that could be replicated by other resistance movements throughout territories, where federal authority remained limited and local governance reflected the interests of settler populations rather than Eastern political establishments. The intelligence networks, communication systems, and elimination techniques that had been developed during the campaign against bounty hunters had created a model for systematic resistance that could be adapted to confront other forms of oppression and exploitation. Reports from law enforcement agencies throughout the West had documented similar patterns of mysterious deaths and disappearances affecting other categories of targets who threatened vulnerable communities. Corrupt territorial officials, abusive mine supervisors, and merchants who cheated desperate settlers had begun experiencing the same kinds of apparent accidents and sudden illnesses that had characterized the elimination of bounty hunters during the peak of network operations. The methods had spread through underground communication networks that connected different resistance movements, creating a contagion of systematic justice that federal authorities found impossible to contain through conventional law enforcement approaches. Liora's personal fate had become the subject of speculation and legend throughout communities that had been affected by the network's operations, with stories that attributed supernatural capabilities to a woman whose actual whereabouts remained unknown to federal investigators, despite rewards that exceeded the bounties that had once been offered for the return of escaped slaves. Some accounts placed her in California, where gold mining operations had created opportunities for people with ambiguous legal status to establish new identities and accumulate resources that could support continued resistance activities. Others suggested that she had crossed into Mexican territory, where abolition had created opportunities for former slaves to establish legitimate businesses and social relationships that would be impossible in territories where racial restrictions remained legally enforced. The most persistent stories had described Liora as having established a school for teaching the techniques of systematic resistance, training new generations of operatives who could carry the network's methods to territories and communities, where organized opposition to slavery and related forms of oppression could serve strategic objectives that extended beyond the immediate protection of escaped slaves. These accounts had portrayed her as having evolved from individual avenger to educator, whose influence would multiply through students who carried her knowledge to conflicts throughout the expanding territories, where federal authority remained weak and local governance reflected the interests of those who possessed the resources to control territorial development. Federal attempts to suppress the spread of network methods through censorship and intimidation had proven largely ineffective against oral traditions and communication systems that operated independently of official channels. The same technologies and social networks that had enabled westward expansion had also created opportunities for resistance movements to share information and coordinate activities across vast distances, making it impossible for territorial authorities to prevent the dissemination of knowledge that threatened established systems of control and exploitation. The long-term impact of the network's campaign had been most visible in the evolution of slavery as an institution in territories where economic development depended increasingly on wage labor and voluntary migration. rather than the forced labor systems that had characterized agricultural regions in established states. The demonstration that organized resistance could systematically eliminate the enforcement mechanisms that made slavery profitable had accelerated economic changes that were already making traditional plantation agriculture less viable in regions where climate and geography favored mining, ranching, and trade rather than large-scale crop cultivation. By 1854, territorial newspapers had begun reporting that the, quote, frontier disappearances had effectively ended organized bounty hunting as a profession in the Western Territories, with the few remaining slave catchers operating in small groups that focused on avoiding attention rather than pursuing systematic campaigns against escaped slave communities. The transformation had been attributed to various factors including increased federal law enforcement presence and changes in territorial legislation, but informed observers had recognized that the primary cause had been the systematic elimination of an entire generation of professional slave catchers whose replacement had proven impossible under conditions where the profession's practitioners faced organized assassination rather than the passive resistance that had previously characterized opposition to slavery enforcement. The network's success had also influenced broader debates about slavery and federal authority that had been developing throughout the 1850s. As territorial expansion had forced confrontation between different regional approaches to race relations and labor systems. The demonstration that systematic resistance could neutralize federal enforcement mechanisms had provided practical evidence for arguments that slavery could not be sustained without active federal support, contributing to political discussions that would eventually shape national policy regarding territorial governance and the expansion of slavery into Western regions. Most significantly, the campaign had established precedents for organized resistance that would influence subsequent conflicts throughout American history, providing both tactical methods and strategic principles that could be adapted to confront other forms of systematic oppression and exploitation. The techniques developed for eliminating bounty hunters had proven applicable to other categories of targets whose activities threatened vulnerable communities, creating a model for systematic justice that operated independently of official legal systems that might be compromised by political or economic interests. The ultimate legacy of Liora Cindrelle and her network of systematic killers had been the demonstration that organized resistance could achieve strategic objectives that individual acts of defiance could never accomplish, transforming the relationship between oppressor and oppressed in ways that would influence American social development long after the immediate conflicts over slavery had been resolved through other means. Their campaign had proven that invisibility could be weaponized, that patience could be lethal, and that systematic planning could overcome advantages in resources and legal authority when properly applied by people who possessed both sufficient motivation and adequate knowledge of their enemies' vulnerabilities. The 30 masters who had died during their campaign represented not just individual victories over specific oppressors, but the systematic destruction of an entire infrastructure of exploitation that had made the Western Territories hunting grounds for escaped slaves seeking freedom in lands that had promised security but delivered only new forms of danger and uncertainty. Their elimination had transformed the American frontier from a region where slavery could be extended through private enforcement mechanisms into territory where freedom could be secured through collective action and systematic resistance to those who would deny it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.